All right, and as I noted in my email, the purpose of this is to really, talk grant funding opportunities, and Jen put together an awesome spreadsheet. Karen, I will forward this to you too, since you weren't on the original email. But a great spreadsheet with all sorts of funding possibilities, as well as her recommendations, since that's really the phase that we're at here. So Jen, I'll just turn it over to you to walk us through. I'm sharing my screen. You may not be able to see that, but I'm sharing my screen so we can see. Okay, so I've got the spreadsheet up if you want to walk us through it.
Sure. So really, I'll try to basically succinctly summarize the what and why of the spreadsheet and what I did. I think everyone pretty much already understands the difficulty in finding funding for this project. It's primarily a disaster mitigation project, and really outside of FEMA, there are very few, if any, funding opportunities that are a one-to-one specific match for disaster mitigation or prevention programs. So I did include the FEMA disaster and hazard mitigation programs on here because they are a really great match for this project. And I think the project has a lot going for it in terms of funding from these FEMA programs. But these are really highly competitive funding programs, and they're really difficult to apply for, and they require just a ridiculous amount of resources to not only apply for, but also to administer throughout the process. So the other issue with a lot of federal funding is that particularly federal funding programs that focus on capital and infrastructure projects, across the board, you are not ever allowed to use federal funding to match federal grant funding. And in addition, there are a lot of these programs that put a cap on the total amount of federal dollars that can be allocated to a project. So I understand that there is still on the table the possibility of receiving ARPA funds through Congressman Neguse, and if I'm not saying that correctly, please forgive me. But that ARPA funding is all federal, and so depending on how much of that funding comes through, if any, there's a good chance that it could disqualify you from a lot of these federal programs because it may already exceed or reach the cap of the federal allocation for the project as a whole. So it's pretty much for those two reasons that what you're seeing here is an attempt at a very creative approach to finding other sources of funding. And so it's looking at what are some other ways that we could package this project. And so a couple of ways that I looked at it is, I think the best one is as also a fire mitigation project. So there's some wildfire mitigation programs on here. There are some recreational programs on the list, and it's mostly state, local, or private funding opportunities. And then the other thing that I looked at for this was like environmental related funding opportunities. A couple of other ways that we could look at this, if, I mean, this would pretty much be me relying on JVA to say, yes, there is a component, or no, there isn't a component of it. But if there's any, say, a stormwater management component, ensuring that the road's not going to be flooded, then we could potentially look at some water grants. And then I think the other thing I tossed around was endangered habitats and endangered species improvement, prevention, or, like grants related to preserving habitats, endangered habitats and endangered species, which is kind of a tough one because on one hand, you're pulling down trees and you're creating a road, which may result in traffic, which isn't great for habitats, but at the same time, fire is also really bad for preserving habitats. So it's a stretch, but it could certainly be another direction to go if at some point we decided to go that way. So I think really that kind of encapsulates why the grant programs you see are on here. It's just my way of looking for a creative approach to finding additional sources of funding. And then in terms of recommendations, primarily my recommendation is if you get that money from ARPA, that's going to be your federal funding. Only look at those FEMA programs if that funding falls through. And if it does fall through, then I feel like you really don't have any other choice but to look at those FEMA programs for a good chunk of your funding. But typically I would say 50% is usually what they might cap it at. And again, you can't use any federal funds to match federal funds. So your matching will always have to come from a state, local, private source or your general funds. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So Mayor Larson, and heading into this meeting, unfortunately did not know from Nagoose where we stand on being a financial priority. And I think, and I'm actually not even entirely sure if that's tied to ARPA or if that was just a financial priority for him. But long story short, there really is no update there. So I think we need to keep in our mind that FEMA may be the route we go, since we were hoping to hear an update by the end of February. But I would love to just kind of run down the list and see if, given what Jen has here, if you have questions. And I'd like to maybe start with the fire department, especially when looking at grants where we tie in the mitigation component. And so Rick and Mike, what are your thoughts on what Jen's provided here and strategies and how that could intersect with fire department?
Well, Rick, I don't know if you have something. I just have something very kind of small, and Rick can follow up on this. It's just that one thing that we would definitely love is that partnership of moving forward. But there's one thing that we just couldn't really do ourselves, is like lead the charge on certain type of projects. So whenever we start to take on something, we want to look at the community as a whole. So we would definitely be willing to help and be able to help, but we want to look at, if we do for one, we're going to do for all. So we didn't want to just look at offering just certain services. So that was just one thing that I just want to reiterate, that we're definitely a team player and we want to help everyone. So I don't know what that looks like in the future, but Rick, do you have something?
Yeah, just looking through these grants a bit earlier, and I'm a little concerned with the mitigation aspect, because really mitigation for this road is mitigation for the road. It doesn't really help mitigate fire danger to that community out there. It's just specific to the egress. So I think we have to be careful of that. We typically don't get, and the reason for that is we don't get fires coming from that direction, typically going then downhill into there. They come from a different direction. So there is a small component of mitigation in there, but I think it's going to be hard to really play that as a big part of this. And yeah, I think that what Jen gave there is a good rundown. I looked through this a little bit this morning, the different grants, and there's only one of those FEMA grants, the BRIC, the Building Resilience, seemed to be actually the closest fit, I think, of all of them. DOLA Minerals, I know, have been a good grant for a lot of agencies over the years. That seems to be pretty well used by fire departments. And I don't know how you tie in the mineral side of that, other than these are old mining communities and roads were kind of a shambles. Might be able to play that part. And then the
I think
state.
the challenge is that that's the funding we're going to go for the comprehensive plan.
Okay.
And so until that's done, then that funding is off the table. The goal is to pursue that either this year or early next year, which means that funding wouldn't be available again until mid next year for us.
Right. And then the
So
other one was,
to consider.
and then the third one that I was the State Forest Service wildfire risk grant seemed to have some applicability. I don't recall what the grant, how high that could go. And that one seemed to be.
Okay. I feel like, isn't this the one we looked at before, Rick, though, but we didn't qualify because we're not considered rural?
That could be. I just looking at the information that was here.
Yeah.
I don't recall the specifics for that.
I think Jen, I mean, we may need to pursue that one again, but I think, Rick, that was the one we were aiming for. And then when we got deep into getting ready to apply, it's that weird Boulder County money problem that hurts us.
Right.
For which one?
Okay.
This forest restoration and wildfire risk mitigation grant. Rick and I went for that. Yeah. We started to, and we were told that we didn't qualify. And I'll send you the email. I have an email of why we didn't qualify, but long story short, it was basically median household income that kept us from being, because we're within Boulder County, that kept us from qualifying.
So, yeah, send me the email because, and also I would ask when you applied for that grant, because we just did come out with we didn't, but, you know, they just released census findings, which can sometimes complicated can be good sometimes, depending on where we are. But like a lot of, every agency uses a different source of where they consider rural. So a lot of times it'll depend on who, or what their source of determining rural is. Now, the reason that it's better when we're not in a new census year is that almost everybody's going to use the most recent census because it's brand new. So that really tends to be more of a factor when we're further away from a new census, and different agencies will look at different population estimates, or they won't look at population estimates and they'll look at a census from years ago. So sometimes that's a factor, but also, yeah, I wouldn't consider your median household income as part of Boulder, but I recognize that Nederland does have some pretty high dollar houses, and that it's really all about that average of median household income overall. But sometimes you can also, they'll allow you to look at a census tract, but I don't know much about the Big Springs area. So even if we tried to pare it down to a census tract median household income, if that were allowable, it still might be too high, because I at least think that's a pretty affluent area. Am I wrong?
I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, I'd agree.
But I think, yeah, it's still worth looking at a little bit further to see whether that's a factor or not. And then in terms of some of the other wildfire mitigation programs, well, let me take a quick step back. I didn't do a super extensive dive into any of these grant programs. This was sort of a quick sweep of, hey, yeah, I think we could make a connection to that. It's got a decent amount of money available, and on the surface, we are eligible. So a lot of that could depend too on an application. So if we're talking about fire mitigation, that would simply be one portion of the project to fund. We would chunk the project out to the portion of whatever needs to be done to extend that road, which I assume is there's going to be some felling of trees. The road needs to be widened, which could be considered a good fire break. So if the application were to ask specifically how many fires come from that direction, then that could exclude it, but if we don't have to provide that information, then it could still be a potential.
So Nathan, can you remind us, and I don't know if you were a part or who was having this conversation, of where the Forest Service kind of stood on the support since we crossed into their public lands?
I don't think they had any opposition to it, but I don't know if there was much support coming from the Forest Service.
Okay.
In terms
I think
of
that was one
financial
question,
support?
Yeah, do we have to take this on? Is it basically the understanding that we're absorbing this financially for the whole project and there are no other public entities to support us?
I know that whenever I talked to Ed about helping, he said that they are willing and have the equipment and things of that nature to help. But he wasn't sure about when and how long it'd take, since they do kind of deploy a little bit on those fires.
And that's to help with the construction of the egress. Any financial help coming in? Do you know?
No, they said they got strong backs, but just not thick checkbooks.
Okay, wouldn't that be nice if we all had that? Okay. So is that, I mean, Jesse, I know you've been around too for a while, and I'm jumping into this, I think, a little later. Rick, is that everyone's understanding that Netherland is the sole funder of this?
Well, this is Tanya. I think that the Foreside 2 project has it's going to do a lot of mitigation up at the top of that ridge that will make much of that work
Okay.
not our responsibility, because they're going to do it. It just depends if we wait for them or if we do it before. But I know that that ridge is going to be cut up, and there'll be roads put in, like login roads. So to a certain degree, some of that work will be done by the Forest Service if we wait.
Cool.
And I think county parks may help a little bit with where it crosses their property, but by and large, yeah, I think the funding's all going to have to come from the local community or grants. But yes, I don't think anybody else is necessarily has a vested interest in seeing this route go through.
And that's another challenge from a grant perspective outside of the hazard mitigation piece, is the reach of the impact is really limited. So it really is limited to this community. It doesn't have this sort of broader overarching impact, except from the perspective that it could keep, fire from spreading further into the town, but depending on the direction it comes from. But it doesn't have this, often grant funders want to see a pretty big impact for their money, which is part of the reason that I started looking a little bit at the recreation grants. And I know that that's a very sensitive subject for the residents, so that would also have to be carefully considered. But the thing I pointed out to Miranda is there are already trails back there. They exist. And I believe that there's even a Doughhead trailhead right near or at where this road will start. And that's a fact. And so there is potential for trying to package this as a trails project. It doesn't mean that you have to necessarily publish it or promote it as such. It just has to be typically publicly accessible, which it already is. But I understand that that would be certainly a factor that would have to be considered before any recreational funding is considered.
So I would love to hear, Jesse, Karen, and Tanya, since you are over there, just two things. A, like your response, what's your thought about that? And then also if looking at these fundings, if you've had a chance, I know I just sent it out, if there's any that stand out as ones you'd like us to dive into more. So Jesse, do you want to kick us off with your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just finding it kind of hard to see how you could package that as a trails as a trails plan. I mean, there are a bunch of trails, but it pretty much will follow the Ridgeline Trail up there. So yeah, I mean, I kind of agree. ARPA would be the ideal, and followed by FEMA for funding. But I guess my main concern at this point is still just that the old route through the wetlands is the one that is officially signed off on. So I think just a lot of the residents would like to see some kind of commitment on part of the town to approve the Ridgeline route at some point and rescind the prior route approval, and then at least we've got something to work off of, something more solid.
So we're kind of at a weird place with the Board of Trustees. Mayor Larson and I have been talking about, like, we're hesitant to want to bring anything really next week that it's going to impact a new board. And so I think, yes, I agree. And I would argue it's one of the first things the new board should do, since they're going to be the ones to ultimately get us, hopefully, at least to the funding, through the funding side of this, that it makes sense that they fully understand. So I will flag that to put on for May to get that formally done. Is it possible to get a ProSab kind of statement of support as we head in?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Tanya, do you have other thoughts about, the recreation kind of thought process, or you want to see funding?
I don't think the recreation angle is the way to go, because I really think we've been saying that it's, we're not trying to promote it for, any sort of motorized usage, or really a whole lot, especially if we use it to connect to the driveways. I think we're promising them that we don't want anybody on this, but that when it's not, unless it's an emergency. So I don't think that's the right angle. I think, in truth, it's going to harm the recreational aspect of the area, because it's going to make a road where there was a trail. But I think that Wildlife Matter one, or whatever, Wildfire Matters grant, looks like you guys check all the boxes for it. Just the Wildfire Matters, the Colorado State Forest Service one at the end, the last one of the last ones.
Oh, okay.
That seems like a good one that this would work under. It doesn't have amount of money in there that you would get, but I don't know. To me, that seems like a worthwhile looking at that.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks. Karen Blakemore.
Oh, hi.
Oh, I do want to say really quick about that Wildfire Matters. That's the reason that there's not any funding information in there, is that it's not a grant program yet. It's still under development, and it has a timeline for potential release next March, I believe. But it doesn't exist yet.
Good to know.
That's too bad. But maybe next year, so.
Yeah. Karen?
Hi, I haven't had time to really study the different grant opportunities, but I do agree with what Tanya had to say about a recreational grant for this trail, and how that probably isn't appropriate, because the egress route goes through private driveways, I believe. And when I have been out talking to residents, and I talked to the owner of 60 Doe Trail, and that was a couple weeks ago, and he was not aware of the current proposed route. So he was still unsure whether that was going to be going through his drive. So I think it's important to get this out to the public, to the folks who will be using it, so they can, weigh in on it, and the people who it will impact most directly will be able to see it. As far as the mitigation grant, I heard what Rick said about fire not usually coming in that direction. And so, I think that should play into our decision about which grants to apply for. And that's all I have to say.
Cool. Thanks, Karen. So I'm curious in knowing this route piece, is your recommendation, Karen and Jesse, that we push this out, ask for feedback, and then come to the new Board of Trustees with that feedback and try to do that work when we're in this weird election limbo time frame?
That sounds good.
We're about to release another survey, a Safe Build survey, so I feel like we're a little survey heavy. Maybe we'll take a couple weeks, 2 weeks, and then launch this beginning of April. Ask for feedback throughout April, then bring it in May. And then Karen, just so you know, the targeted outreach with some of those very specific neighbors who are more directly impacted did fall with Rick Durr. We weren't really sure where we wanted to pick that up when we didn't know what the funding was going to look like. And so I think that's going to be a big part of that conversation when we push this out publicly is, yes, we're looking at this route, but we, I hate to say it, but we have no idea how we're going to fund it. And so we were concerned about getting too ahead of ourselves if funding becomes our next, obviously, huge battle.
But and I think we also don't have permission to use those driveways as we speak. Last I knew, they were really against it. Everybody in that neighborhood.
So it's not. Yeah. So I think permission. We're looking at the neighbor action and making sure that being that they're aware and that there is buy-in. There legally is no requirement to get their permission because it's not a single occupancy driveway. It can be used publicly. And so that's where, of course, it gets a little tricky. And we don't want to come in heavy-handed to say, we are doing this, but we don't need written approval to do so. That written permission would come just because it's
okay. That's kind of new news to me because I had thought that that was a private driveway and owned by the people who access their homes through that driveway. But you're saying that it's actually part of Netherlands' purview?
Yeah, so we have to take a look at all of the survey, and she did determine that town can address off that driveway without formal approval of the properties that are the.
But okay, that's good news. But then isn't there like a slight amount of private property that has to get pushed through, or is it not? To get
That's my understanding that
oh, it goes straight to the public land, to the open space. Okay, that's good news. Okay, well then that solves that problem. I honestly think that if we wait for Foresight 2 to come in, they're going to do the majority of the work. And then most of our work would have to be the driveway, making it wide enough for the fire trucks and that little bit connecting to the ridge.
Rick, are you under a different impression about access from the driveway?
Tanya, you might, you gotta.
Yeah, there's a big echo there, but yeah, there is a section of private property that this will need to cross. The switchbacks, the road does not go directly to the fence. So I think it's 50 feet, 100 feet, something like that. And whatever, 20 feet wide or whatever it'd have to be. So it's not as clean as it may sound. That's all.
Maybe to revisit that conversation with Jennifer, because I don't think we were at a place where we needed that kind of reverse condemnation type situation. Mm-hmm. I have to go back and I'd like to revisit that and then reconnect with this group. Okay.
I have a quick question, Miranda, for maybe what kind of assistance we might be able to get for outreach. Like, because we've got quite a lot of the media maybe pretty much ready to go, like just this basic information. Could we get some support with printing and maybe targeted mail-in for Big Springs residents?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that we could definitely do that. What I can do, so the next time we would be set to reconnect would be April 12th. I'm almost proposing that maybe we try to come back together March 29th, and I can bring to you a public outreach strategy, plus clean up where the town's access to public land from this and what that process from Attorney Madsen's standpoint would look like. Could people meet on the 29th at noon? Tuesday, the 29th?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to assume that works for. So I think then our next steps, and I'll try to get that information again. I'm stepping in. I was not a part of any of the original conversations, and so I'm getting a lot of stuff. I'm pulling a lot of stuff together from previous teams. So let me get clarification on that ownership piece, and I will email the team in advance. And then we'll plan to meet on Tuesday the 29th. And I think Jen Waltz, between now and then, maybe I'll see if I can get more information on the Goose funds, but we could start looking at that FEMA, the forest restoration, wildfire risk mitigation, and the BRIC as maybe some options.
Yeah, so if one thing I would recommend doing as soon as possible, so requirement for most or all of those FEMA hazard mitigation programs, all of the programs there, is that you have to have a locally approved, local FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan. And so if Netherland doesn't have one, check to see if Boulder County has one. And the project should be in that hazard mitigation plan. So those would be two things to look at.
Yeah, Boulder County does, but they're in the midst of an update. And so I think it would be in our best interest to wait until the update is done, because I know the update does have this as an area of priority.
Okay. Yeah, you might try to find out what they expect, like what their timeline is, not just for finishing it, but for submitting it to FEMA for approval.
Okay.
Because that is the primary part of the requirement, is that FEMA has approved it. And I don't know what FEMA's timeline is. I mean, for all I know, it could be you submit it and it's 6 months before they approve it. I just don't know. But looking at that timeline would be important. And then the other thing I would consider is more than likely what you would also need to pursue any of this FEMA funding is a cost benefit analysis, which JVA would probably do. So might want to check in with them and just find out what they would charge for that. And FEMA has a cost benefit analysis calculator.
Nathan, am I safe to assume JVA could do that if we needed to go this route?
Yeah, I believe we can at least help support the effort. It might take some outside feedback from other sub-consultants, but I think we can happily help the charge in getting that figured out.
Okay.
And if I can find, I should be able to find one. FEMA provides, like a spreadsheet that you just have to fill in, basically. I should be able to find one. If I can find one, I'll grab a copy of it and send it over to you, so you can at least look at it and see what they're looking for. Yeah,
that would be great.
Cool. So I think that's our path forward. Does anyone else have anything that comes to mind? Anything you think we need to discuss?
I just had one question in regards to the grants on here. The second one from the top that was being displayed, I was curious if that was at all applicable.
Which one is it?
The fire prevention and safety grant?
I mean, that one's another one. So first and foremost, only the fire department is eligible to apply for that. And that's another one that would be sort of, you'd have to create something around it. to make that a feasibility, but they have a research and development component to that grant. And then the other piece that I recall seeing that kind of struck my interest or it was more about training and providing, yeah, that one was a bit of a reach, but if there could be like a way to sort of identify an R&D component, a research and findings component to it, that was the connection I was sort of looking at.
And it seems like firefighter safety, like this is a huge component of the egress, is to get firefighters in and out of in case of the disaster. So that.
I'm wondering though, Mike, is that kind of what you were referencing though? Like if there was a grant that needed the fire department to apply for, are you not so sure fire department would want to take that on just because it's not all encompassing of your service area?
Yeah, and that would be like for us, you know, I mean, it'd be difficult for us to just write a grant for one certain area. I mean, we could try our hardest to facilitate that, but what we would try to do, like for example, if we would write a grant for mitigation and we got that funding for mitigation, then we would have like certain areas that we would feel that'd be the high risk, and those would be the ones that we would do first. And then we'd slowly go like that. So like, but when it comes to writing grants for certain projects, it's most of those fire department grants is like designed for the fire department to kind of benefit as well as the community to benefit from those type of grants. And I think that like it'd be hard for us to kind of justify writing a grant and all that funding going to a certain project without the fire department being a part of that. So I think us working as a team and moving forward, we just have to look for that type of funding that is just not fire department specific. We might be able to, you know, maybe accommodate some of those needs when it comes to those grants, but I think we need to look for that all encompassing if the fire department's going to be a part of that grant process, as well as like, I know when someone was talking about getting that permission and or the town technically wouldn't have to and all that. We definitely want to have those conversations prior because we don't want the, you know, no offense towards anyone else, but we don't want the fire department to turn out to be the bad guys because we're trying to help the community. So, but yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about, Miranda.
Okay, cool, thanks.
And that really is the only grant here that would require the fire department to be the fiscal sponsor and active in it. Those other mitigation grants, it doesn't have to be the fire department. Local governments are eligible to apply for those.
Cool, that's good to know. Does anyone else have anything to talk about or to add to our to-do list?
Just to kind of go back to the shared driveway, that was kind of, I know that's been kind of a contentious issue for a long time in regards to accessing it from the driveway, but obviously it makes sense for several reasons to get folks higher on the ridge than it is to put them in the valley where they could be susceptible to fire. But I haven't looked into that either. Would that require an easement, or could that be something that could I think that would be required, you know, if we're going to use it as like a public route at some point, right? There would be an easement going up the driveway at least to the point in which it's exiting the private property and going on to Boulder County and U.S. Forest Service.
So I don't have my notes on me, and I don't, Rick, I believe you may have been at that meeting. I don't recall an easement being discussed. I know ultimately we had asked Attorney Madsen to look at whether or not that was considered a private driveway, and her assessment was that it was not.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Rick, do you remember that meeting? I wish I had my notes from back then.
I don't recall the specifics of that. I know easements have been discussed and pros and cons of easement versus some other more forceful way of getting the property. So I don't recall
I think that was our goal, was to avoid that forcefulness. And so then when it was determined that it was it was not a single like owner specific driveway that we could access that created a lot more fees, and then the discussion just turned to solely getting buy-in from the neighbors and not that formal permission. Although Rick, I think you bring up an interesting, that there's a section that does cross through. I'm not sure we assessed that when we talked with Jennifer back in the day, and that was like 6+ months ago and this is back when Rick Durr was still here.
Let me look up something real quick here and just.
I'm trying to look it up too. So
Who currently maintains that driveway? Is it the local 4 residents that take care of it, or is the town contributing at all?
I believe
No,
it's
town's
just the
not.
residents.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, because I think that's something we'd want to think about too. And I'm a little bit I can't recall exactly how well that driveway was laid out, but I know it's tight coming around the turn, and I don't know if it met all the radiuses. So I recall there being a certain level of improvement that would need to be made to the driveway alone just to get to that access point.
I think Rick said that. Yeah, one of those turns would need to be right in order to get a fire engine up there.
Yeah, I
Right.
just pulled up the county assessor's webpage and looking at it, and I think there was a request at some point for, I don't know how far it went, but for JVA to look at whether or not what it would cost to bring even that driveway up to spec for as an egress or fire access. And just looking at this map, it's probably, I'm going to guess in the neighborhood of 50 feet off of the switchback to get to the public lands, which I think there is forests, but so that
Yeah.
there's a chunk there that needs to be crossed. The road doesn't go right to it, and obviously there's can the road be made to accommodate large trucks?
Yeah, without disturbing the residents too much, because if they're already opposed to it, building that road wider might get some pushback.
Yeah, and I
But
believe that second switchback as you're coming up, which is the one that's the biggest issue, has a pretty good rock wall on one side of it. It's going to need to get pushed back or a lot of creative dirt work to make that work. And I don't know if it's in direct view of any of those houses, but that could certainly be concerning as well.
yeah, exactly. I know. Yeah, we've put together exhibits and kind of more a conceptual level of drawings on this access point, but to date, we haven't done any survey on that driveway and what the existing condition looks like to actually assess the grading and all the turning radiuses needed. So that would be something we'd probably want to think about moving forward too, and how big of an impact it would be on that driveway.
One thing to consider
if this is an egress if this is both an egress route for residents and a potential ingress route for fire equipment, that it has to be big enough to accommodate both, right? People leaving and people coming in. So not just big enough to accommodate fire apparatus, but residents leaving at the same time.
And I think really it's an egress route. I mean, yes, once people are out,
then
I
you
can see
go
us
in.
using it. The other thing is, if the town does this project and makes a big change to that road, that will probably require the town to do ongoing maintenance of it. So there's that additional long-term cost of doing that. And where this driveway turns off of Doe Trail, it's going to need some work in that area as well, just to keep it maintained long-term. I think Chris Pelletier brought that up in one of our conversations a long while back.
I think that's a good point. I would ask Forest Service, I would consider asking the Forest Service to maintain the parts of the road on its lands, and maybe the open space to maintain the road on its portion of lands. But that might be a little bit difficult to, manage and ensure is occurring, but that could be a pretty big expense.
Yeah, I don't think they're gonna do that. Do you guys think they would maintain that road and clear off the trees that fall and all that? I think that's gonna be on us.
Worth a try.
Yeah, I mean, the worst they can do is say no.
Yeah, so I did send, I have a meeting with Jennifer Madsen this afternoon, so I just kicked this over to her. I did find one of the emails where on the plat, it does show a dedication to the town of Netherland, which is why there isn't necessarily the need for that quote unquote approval, but she did note here that she'd like to see stronger language related to and pursuing a specific driveway easement, Nathan, and then adding stronger language into this plat. She's not feeling like it's strong enough. So we'd want to pursue that, which of course would require the neighbors to sign off on any sort of replat and subsequent notes on a plat. So it's a little tricky in the sense of like that permission side, Tanya. I think it is more, there will be some more legal components though to make sure that there's buy-in and that's well documented. So, but I'll send, once I talk to Jennifer, I'll send more information. So it sounds like those are pieces we need to work on, and that's why I do think when we talk public outreach, these are things we need to have further clarification on, because especially we're going to do targeted outreach to not only Big Springs residents, but those residents. We need to make sure we understand kind of the legal components that we'd be pursuing here.
Yeah.
Which, I guess one of my hesitations in doing so is having those conversations without the Board of Trustees even knowing that these are legal components. And now I'm not so sure doing public outreach without the Board of Trustees being aware first seems appropriate. And I may turn to Tanya and Karen, obviously, since you're running, what your thoughts is, but I would hate to do too much of this outreach if the new Board of Trustees doesn't support this strategy.
Yeah.
Tanya and Karen, what do you think?
Go ahead, Tanya.
Oh, I think it could wait for sure, because you're talking about starting this. I think you could easily wait and bring it up as one of the first items that gets discussed with the new
Kind of
board.
what I'm thinking, do like the fifth meeting or third, whatever day it is, that we could talk about this then, because I want to make sure that this new board agrees to the proposal. Karen, would you agree?
That sounds good. Yeah, I think it's important to be really clear with the neighbors who use that driveway as to what the use and ownership and easement and all that. We wouldn't want to surprise them at a public meeting.
Well, I think we just need to know first before we do that.
Yeah. Okay. So
yeah, I think still meeting on the 29th makes sense. So I'll have more information and we can talk about it further. I do agree, Karen. I don't want to like blindside anyone.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of unknowns at the same time that could create more chaos and confusion and frustration if we don't know all the answers.
Yeah.
Okay. So Jennifer Waltz and I will take it from here, it sounds like, and we will come back together on the 29th at noon, but I will send a few emails. Just a reminder, though, there are a few boards and commission members, so this is not a reply all situation if you're a part of a board and commission. So if you have further thoughts about the grants Jennifer sent, if you look that over more, please just respond just to me, and then we'll make sure it gets out to the whole group. We're making baby steps, though. Yes. Going in the right direction. So, is there anything else? Okay, if not, we'll see each other in like 3 weeks.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye.